to a special episode of Explore Christianity as we examine some of the textual criticism, not in a New Testament book that you might be used to hearing, because usually I'm on here talking about manuscripts in the New Testament. We're actually going to talk about the book of Isaiah. Now, one of the things that excites me is looking at manuscripts. Anybody that watches this program or has known me for any length of time, put out manuscripts, and especially if they're different, it really gets me excited. It gets some people worried. It gets me excited. And so what I decided to do is actually not bring somebody in that would actually agree with everything that I believe and agree with everything that I would say and do when it comes to the manuscripts, or particularly to the differences in the manuscripts or about the authorship behind the book itself. And so what I decided to do is bring in a Dead Sea Scrolls scholar, because why not? I mean, that's the best way to deal with these problems, is to bring somebody in that actually knows what they're talking about when dealing with these manuscripts. So I brought on a friend, and this is Dr. Kipp Davis to everybody in the audience. We do not, I know it's hard for everybody to believe, we do not see eye to eye on everything, but we both get really excited about this discussion. We both get excited about dealing with manuscripts. So, Dr. Kipp, tell everybody a little bit about yourself, your background, some of the published work you have, and the research you've done, and then we'll jump right into the discussion.
Sure. Thanks, Stephen. It's nice to be here. My name is Kipp Davis. I have a PhD in religions theology from the University of Manchester, where I specialized in early Judaism, its history and literature, with a focus on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls is where I have spent pretty much my entire professional career writing and studying and working on texts. And within the Dead Sea Scrolls, I'm probably most widely known. Oh, there's the dog. Okay. I'm probably most widely known for my work in scribal practices and in manuscript reconstruction and paleography. So that's probably most of what I do. I was also very much involved in the project at the Museum of the Bible and in the Skyne collection to publish these private collections of small Dead Sea Scrolls fragments, and then was involved in the scholarly investigation of them and in drawing conclusions about them as modern forgeries. So that's me, I guess.
And you were able to actually be there in the presence of the Dead Sea Scrolls, right?
You make it sound like they're imbued with personality.
They glow, don't they? Somebody told me there was glittery glow and sunshine coming off the pages.
So, I mean, some of them are like literally just nothing but gelatinous goo now. So yes, I have. It is. So I have been to Israel to work on Dead Sea Scrolls manuscripts in person a few times. Most recently, I think, was 2014. I was working on a K4 copy of the War Scroll. I was there as well working on the so-called Apocryphon of Jeremiah manuscripts, which are the manuscripts that I wrote my dissertation on. But I was there the first time, and this probably requires some explanation too. The official like the collections of the Dead Sea Scrolls in Israel and in Jordan. Israel doesn't have all of them. There's still some in Jordan, in Amman. But the ones that are in Israel, in Jerusalem, are actually housed in two different places. They're both at the Israel Museum, but about 30, I think it's about 30 or 35 of the manuscripts are housed at what's called the Shrine of the Book. And these include all the ones that go on display in their museum display area, and it includes easily the most famous of the Dead Sea Scrolls manuscripts, the Great Isaiah Scroll 1Q Isaiah A. So that's at the Shrine of the Book. You have to walk like another block. The museum is like a large campus. It's indoor, like there's a few buildings, but you have to walk like a block down to get to the holdings of the Israel Antiquities Authority, which is where most of the fragments, that's like all the fragments from caves 2 through cave 11 are housed. So yeah, so it's and I've been in both locations, but the very first time I was in Israel to see and to work on the Dead Sea Scrolls was when I was still a PhD student. Way back in 2005, I was like a brand new PhD student, and I was assisting professors Eugene Ulrich and Peter Flint in the work that they were doing specifically on 1Q Isaiah A as well as 1Q Isaiah B. These are the two Isaiah manuscripts that were found in Cave 1. So they were writing the official edition, the official publication of these manuscripts, and I was there to help them for like a week. So
That's exciting.
that was pretty exciting, and they allowed me to snap some photographs while I was inside the vault there. And the one that you have on your background there is a picture that I actually took of 1Q Isaiah A. And they told me too, so we're probably like breaking Israeli law here, and the Mossad is coming to get you, Stephen. Because they told me
I live in Washington State. I'm right next to the Space Needle. You can find me somewhere over there.
It's the Mossad, man. They're gonna find you. So, but yeah, they said I wasn't to I wasn't to to publish these or share them with the public, but
it's probably pretty safe to say most people can't read them. So I mean, it's fine. I mean,
no, it's actually it has mostly to do. I mean, with all these things, it has mostly to do with copyright and ensuring.
Oh, sure.
Right, it's all this kind of stuff. But I mean, there's so many. There's so many pictures, and my pictures are just. I mean, they're not great. They're nothing like the ones that you can see online that the Shrine publishes on their own website. So, right.
Well, I thought you did a good job on the picture, even though they didn't pay you to be a photographer there. But with that being said, let's kind of shift into the Isaiah discussion. You had recently did a video, which there will be a link to that later where people can watch, dealing with the fact that in Christian apologetics on our end of it, one of the things that we believe at Explore Christianity is that we need to clean up our apologetic at times, and that we need to reword things or be as precise as possible and leave openings for correction. And one of the things that you pointed out in that video is that there are Christian apologists who make claim, particularly about Isaiah and the Dead Sea Scrolls, that, well, what they found in the Dead Sea Scrolls was virtually the same thing that we have in the Masoretic text, except for maybe some spellings or things like that. And you quoted some pretty famous apologists on that. And so what we want to do at our apologetic ministry is be more clear, be more precise. And somebody like myself who's done a lot of New Testament textual criticism, I understand the necessity of being precise, not just blanket statement something. What can we do to evaluate a situation like that where somebody says, hey, Dead Sea Scrolls, Masoretic text, basically the same thing, some spelling differences? How do we start correcting that? Because you're pointing out the fact that that's not entirely accurate in every way.
So it's not like, so this is like the problem that I regularly encounter, and it's not just apologists either. This is just by and large a product of the way in which the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls has been told for 70 years now. And there are narrative tropes that continue to get repeated in the media. One of these in particular is about how closely, and it's not just Isaiah, how closely the text of the Bible discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls aligns with the Masoretic text, with the the standard edition, the standard version of the Hebrew text upon which all our English, German, French, Portuguese, Spanish Bibles are translated. Um, so that is not an untrue statement. Um, but it is misleading because it's also an incomplete statement. If you're going to set your selection criteria for only a specific type of text, then you can say, yeah, all these texts we found at Qumran from the Dead Sea Scrolls match the Masoretic text. But the problem with that is that there's a whole bunch of other uh, copies of biblical text or copies of texts that contain, what we now recognize as scripture in the Dead Sea Scrolls that don't match the Masoretic text. There's lots of copies of text which more closely align to the Samaritan Pentateuch, lots of copies of text that more closely align to the Septuagint. One of the really interesting, remarkable, I think, things about the Dead Sea Scrolls collection of literature is that these guys had a strong tolerance for all this variety, all sorts of different editions of the same books in all sorts of different shapes for all sorts of different functions. Um, and I just want to say too, one of the other things that, and this is, I'm doing a deep dive on my YouTube channel right now on the Dead Sea Scrolls, called the Dead Sea Scrolls Unapologetically. And one of the featured talking points, really the topic for the next video that I'm hoping to be finishing this week, is this question of what even is a biblical text when it comes to evaluating manuscripts of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is a classification device that the first scholars applied to certain texts that were coming into the Palestinian Archaeological Museum where they were working. One of the first things they had to do was identify what these fragments were. And so when they saw something that looked like the book of Deuteronomy, they're like, oh, wow, that looks like the book of Deuteronomy. That's a biblical text. Ergo, this is a biblical scroll. But then, this is only 15% of like all the literature that's in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So all this other stuff they had to, that wasn't quote unquote Bible, or at least the Bible that we have, they classified as non-biblical. And that included things like numerous copies of First Enoch or Jubilees, or something called the Aramaic Levi document, or the Temple Scroll, or all these piles of text that we had never even seen before. Things like what I did my PhD dissertation on, the so-called Apocryphon of Jeremiah. So what do you do with these? How do you understand them relative to the quote-unquote Bible? And I think way too much has been made of this distinction in years past, when in actual fact, from the perspective of the people who wrote and collected the text themselves, it's not nearly as obvious and clear which text they regarded as their own scriptures and which text they did not.
Yeah, and that's, even in the New Testament churches, there were certain texts that some churches and portions of the world held on to. Like some of the churches were fond of, the Gospel of Peter, not in the sense of scripture, but they were intrigued by it. But more particularly attached to Peter's name was an apocalyptic version of Peter. There were those in the church that actually held on to it and said, maybe this is a part of our corpus. So there was some even confusion in certain the epistles specifically, or the apocalyptic literature. So that would not be unusual, I guess, from a canonical position, even for Christians, to find that there were communities that had a difficult time distinguishing canonical, non-canonical, etc. So that's interesting that would have been brought up too.
Yes, but I think too, like that's a loosely analogous way of looking at this. The problem with that is, I think a lot of this push toward certainly for the push was stronger within the church than it ever was, within Judaism, I believe. Uh, and it was really pronounced only after the temple was gone. Prior to the destruction of the temple, it looks like the literary landscape was not as, it was a lot muddier. So like for the people who wrote and collected the Dead Sea Scrolls, like there's certain texts that they really liked, that I think you would regard as, scriptures, things, and those would have been like Isaiah, Genesis, the book of Psalms, Exodus, Deuteronomy, but also maybe things like First Enoch, things like Jubilees, things like the Temple Scroll. And again, because they didn't set the parameters, we're still guessing. Scholars are looking at the whole collection. They're looking at what they had to say about texts within their own literature and kind of going, well, this is what we think the situation was, but it's a lot less clear
Yeah,
than
and
even for the church.
one of the gauges, for example, when you're the one thing that is unique to some of the biblical texts that we call in Christianity the canon, etc., in our Bible, is how often the New Testament quoted those works amongst most. There are allusions to First Enoch. Jude quotes
Yep.
from First Enoch, for
Yep.
example. Second Peter alludes to the idea of Tartarus, the place where these fallen
Hmm.
angels, these gods, if you were chained prematurely into judgment for the sin that they did in the flood, going back to First Enoch
Yep.
6. So there is these connections even to those texts that and I know there are some that are in Christianity that try to say, oh, no, those came later. It's like, oh, come on. Like, I mean, the date of these manuscripts are older than the New Testament. Obviously, the New Testament was
Much
following
older. Yeah.
some of the skill sets and interpretations of these other, and we look at the New Testament and that happens as well, and we can start to form an idea of what were they calling theopneustos? What were they calling scripture? What were they calling sacred text or holy men of God that were moved, as Peter alludes to. So there's a lot of good discussion in there. But
Right.
when it gets into Isaiah, what you were claiming is that there is this idea where you're not going to get a whole new text of Isaiah. It's predominantly the same, but that's a misleading, incomplete statement. There are variants that should be notified not just as mere spelling. There actually are
Yeah.
differences that need to be side by side. And if
Pretty
we can, I'd like
significant.
to
Yep.
I'd like to go through some of those if we can.
Sure.
That would be great, and I can pull up your
Sure.
screen
You
for you.
bet. Okay. Yep. So, I mean, I just in preparation for this, I figured I would just pull up the slides basically that I put together for my video that I did, the last one on the Isaiah scrolls from Qumran Cave 1. So I got to preface this by saying that one of the things that apologists uh, particularly have been guilty of doing in the past is focusing on this manuscript at the top, which is the so-called Great Isaiah Scroll, 1Q Isaiah A. It was one of the first three manuscripts uh, taken out of Cave 1. It's remarkable in that it is one of the very few completely intact manuscripts
Hmm.
from the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's very few. This is one of them, and it's very large. It was stored inside of a linen wrapping inside of a jar. I think that the storage had to do with the nature of this particular cave. I think that Cave 1 was something like a Geniza. So everything that was inside this cave was retired manuscripts that were discarded in the same fashion or a similar fashion to how a Jewish synagogue would retire their
What do you think
unused
about what do you think about that? Like what would that say about their perspective of those texts, the way that they discarded? It would maybe have been set apart differently from other maybe texts, or does that say something about the community's perspective of them and how to treat them even
manuscripts?
after wear and tear?
I think it does. But what I think too is this also has to be taken into consideration with everything else that was discovered in Cave One. So it wasn't just the Book of Isaiah. It was also,
Sure.
there's with the same level of care and reverence, they discarded a copy of the War Scroll and a copy of the Chodayot and a copy of the the Community Rule, and as well as the Book of Daniel and other scripture manuscripts, and so but there's fragments from the Book of Enoch in there as well. So like it's
Interesting.
so all that to say, like there's different the caves, the 11 caves. There's 11 caves that are in and around the area of Qumran, which are associated with this site, associated with one another, and they're not just one of the things that I think we need to pay more attention to is and need to spend more time thinking about is that not all the caves were for the same purpose. Like I
That's a good
suggested,
point.
cave one
That's
is,
good.
I think, some kind of a geniza. I think the same thing of cave 11. But cave 4 is pretty unique in that, and this is where most of the material came out of. This looks like it was probably an active repository or a library of some sorts, where there's evidence of shelving units that line the walls inside the cave, and we imagine this is where they stored scrolls that they were using, and they'd come and they'd grab something and they'd take it back and they'd read it, and they'd this is where they kept their stuff. So I was going to say about this manuscript 1Q Isaiah A. It's remarkable in that it is completely intact. It
Hmm.
contains all 66 chapters that we know of the book of Isaiah in 54 columns. The height of the manuscript is about 30 lines for each column. Um, excuse me. It measures in total length 7.34 meters, or about, I think it's 24 or 25 feet in length.
It's incredible. It's incredible.
I know, and I've heard this story that the first owner of 1Q Isaiah A was the Metropolitan of St. Mark's Monastery. His name was Mar Athanasius Samuel, and after he purchased this and 3 other scrolls, he was trying to sell them, and he actually took them on a tour in the United States to exhibit them and try to sell them to like a museum or a university or something. And I heard this story. This is an apocryphal tale that I'm telling, but I got this one from one of the curators who works at the Shrine of the Book, where the 1Q Isaiah A is housed. She said that when Athanasius Samuel would take the scroll out to show people at these exhibits, he would pull it out, and then from one end, there's like if you picture, he'd stand at the end of the table, this long 30-foot table to put the scroll on. He'd take it out of its box, and then he'd grab the one end and then just like whip it out.
Oh my
And then
goodness.
set it down
Oh,
on the table like a whip, like just to unfurl it.
the rest of us, our hearts, like me hearing it, my heart just cringes. Like, oh, stop!
Hey
Don't
man,
say any more. This is a horror
the
story.
1940s.
Oh my
People did
goodness.
crazy. Oh, I almost swore. I'm sorry. People did crazy things back in the 1940s. Did I just kick my camera? Oh.
Slightly.
Okay. So, uh, so it's easily the most impressive manuscript from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it has received a huge amount of attention. I think because of that, but also because it's Isaiah, and the find itself, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, basically took the text critical discussion of the Old Testament back like 1,000 years. In terms of the Hebrew manuscripts that we have available, the next complete copies of any biblical texts exist in the Aleppo Codex or the Leningrad Codex, which date to like 900 and 1000 AD or CE. So these are very, very early witnesses. And at a glance, at a cursory glance, when you're looking at this large manuscript full of Isaiah, it looks like it's very, very much the same as what we have in our Bibles. So what apologists have been very guilty of doing time and time again is saying that this particular manuscript, 1Q Isaiah A, this very impressive complete copy of the book of Isaiah, is virtually identical to the Masoretic text. There is another manuscript of Isaiah that was discovered in this first cave 1, and that's 1Q Isaiah B, which is I have a picture of some of the fragments just below 1Q Isaiah A, and this is a statement that you could make of 1Q Isaiah B. So I've got some information here. I'll just share. So 1Q Isaiah B is not entirely complete, but we're confident that it contained the whole text from Isaiah 1 through 66, just based on the fact of what's left. We have a lot of what's left, but nothing before chapter 7. So the editors have had to reconstruct a lot of the text that's missing. As a whole, the manuscript was only 26 columns compared to the 54 columns of 1Q Isaiah A. Big difference. So the reason for that is the way it was structured. The lines, you'll notice, when they structured this manuscript, they structured it in 50 lines per column as opposed to just 30. And as a result, it's a little shorter, only 3.5 meters or just over 10 feet. But it's shorter but taller, right? And this one in particular, so it's dated to about 50 BCE. And this one contains 183 textual variants in total. Now I think if I remember correctly, there's somewhere around 55,000 words in the book of Isaiah. No, that doesn't seem right. Yeah, maybe it is. So that's out of like 50,000 words. There's only 183. But compared to 1Q Isaiah A, it's much, much closer to the Masoretic text, whereas in 1Q Isaiah A, there are over 2,600 textual variants. In fact, when the editors, Eugene Ulrich and Peter Flint, wrote their edition, one of the things that I did as a PhD student for weeks and weeks and weeks on end was I put together these collections of textual variants, and inside the edition, it's literally pages and pages and pages of variations cataloged from this particular manuscript. Now, I will say the vast majority of them have to do with just small variations, and these are not the spelling variations. That's something different. That's what we call orthography. This is actual, shifts within the text, but they're very, very small sorts of things. The way that you would mark a preposition, whether you attach it to the word or keep it separate. The same with like pronouns, whether it's suffix to the end of the word or separate, those sorts of things. But there are certainly a number of quite interesting, I would say, relatively significant differences within this 2,600 textual variants. So,
yeah, and that's
let me just.
Well, that's kind of unique because I mean, it sounds like based on the amount of words in Isaiah and the variants that the people going through the Hebrew did a better job than the Greeks, because in the New Testament, the variants for the two closest chapters we pretty much have of New Testament manuscripts, there's a minimum of 5 to 6 variants per chapter between the two closest manuscripts. So the New Testament, there's massive difference, but also again, most of them are spelling or word inversions, things like that. But here in the Hebrew, it's quite fascinating that this is two texts found within the same community, though very likely different scribes. But would you say, based on the size of
definitely different scribes?
Yeah, definitely different scribe. Would you say the function of the manuscript may have been different, being a smaller with 26 columns versus the 54, or was that just the choice of the scribe?
So I think what has happened here, what is reflected here, you'll notice too that 1Q Isaiah A is a little bit older than 1Q Isaiah B by 50 years or so. I would say that what we see taking place is I would say functionally they're the same. I think both of these are qualify as what Emmanuel Tove has called deluxe editions, which are large manuscripts for community use, which means that manuscripts are very expensive to produce in the first place, and the very large ones are the ones that you reserve for the most significant, the most important texts, which are also quite large or extensive.
Now,
And because of the size and because of the expense, they're not something that one person owns on his own. These are community
right.
texts. It's the sort of thing that a synagogue would produce their own copy of the Torah or their own copies of individual books. One of the open discussions still among Dead Sea Scrolls specialists is whether or not there were complete Torahs in first century Jerusalem or in first century Palestine. And one of the reasons why scholars argue against the existence of complete Torahs is just because of how unwieldy these scrolls would have been given the way that they were constructed. And this is why I think scribes started to shift to something closer to 1Q Isaiah B, where the columns got higher. And they got a little bit narrower too, interestingly, but basically they started compacting the length and increasing the height, because they wanted to make larger total manuscripts. Something to you can now write a complete Torah scroll on something which contains 50 or 60 lines per column. It doesn't have to be nearly as long. Like this copy of 1Q Isaiah B, they've cut the length down by more than half just by increasing the height. So I would say that the difference between them, this is reflective of, I think, a shift in scribal practices in the period. And we see it happening more and more the later you get. The stuff that we find after the destruction of the temple, this seems to be consistent now, where copies of the Torah in particular are written in these what I've called high and narrower columns. And I think this is an indicator of a status applied to certain manuscripts, and one that's somewhat innovative for the region in this time period. But all that to say, both had the same function, but the differences between them, I think, are reflective of some of this scribal innovation that's taking place.
That's good. And for those that are watching, feel free to put questions in as it goes. We can take some at the end or some comments there. So if you have any questions, feel free to leave those in there. Within the variants, so you're saying that within these 183, the 2,600, these are not the spelling type of. So what kind of? I'm sure you have examples.
So I do have a few.
Let's let's look at them. That'd be
So
great.
we'll now. I mean, right away we know of variation within between different versions, competing versions of the Book of Isaiah. Already prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The text of Isaiah, the preserved Hebrew text, what we call the Masoretic text, which is sort of the standard version, has differences in where the Greek translation of Isaiah has elements that are missing or lacking, and most scholars will tell you that this is reflective of expansion within the book of Isaiah, which is something that we know about, and that scholars will talk about stretching back hundreds of years already into the exilic, even the pre-exilic period, into like the 7th, 6th centuries already. So here's a couple of examples. So you have Isaiah chapter 2, verses 21 to 22 in the Masoretic text. Up on top, to enter the caverns of the rocks and the clefts of the crags, from the terror of Yahweh and from the glory of his majesty when he rises to terrify the earth. This is basically the same as the text reflected in the Greek translation of the Septuagint. However, in the Masoretic text, now there's the addition of a whole new phrase: turn away from mortals who have only breath in their nostrils. For what account are they? Similarly so with Isaiah chapter 36, verses 7 to 8. But if you, and in the Masoretic text, this you is singular, this, and then it's plural in 1Q Isaiah A. And this is actually, we should talk a little bit more about what's going on in Isaiah chapter 36, 7 to 8 in 1Q Isaiah A. If you say to me, we rely on Yahweh our God, is it not he whose high places and altars Hezekiah has removed, saying to Judah and Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar? Come now, make a wager with my master, the king of Assyria. But then look at what's there in the Septuagint. It's a much more condensed, abbreviated text. But if you say we trust in the Lord our God, come in contract now with my Lord, the king of the Assyrians. So scholars suggest that in this instance, the Septuagint preserves like an older form of the text, but then at some point in time during the transmission process, someone has come in and decided this requires some expansion, some clarification. So they've added this whole new sentence in. Is it not he whose high places and altars Hezekiah has removed, saying to Judah and Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar? So we already know that these sorts of changes, these adaptations are taking place. So one of the things that scholars were keenly interested in when the Isaiah scrolls were discovered was, are they going to show us this same sort of thing taking place? What we have discovered is, in several instances, yes, we see in 1Q Isaiah A at least two places where it preserves a shorter, what scholars believe to be an older form of the text than either the Masoretic text or the Septuagint. One of those places is here in Isaiah. Oh shoot, what's do I have the, oh rats, I don't, sorry. I'm gonna have to pull up my my text here, because I don't remember where I am.
While you're pulling that up,
yeah.
while you're pulling that up, it's
So,
interesting to note the expansion process that you're talking about, because one of the things that we see in the New Testament is the scribe's tendency to commentate. A scribe would commentate on what's happening, give explanation. A perfect example is in John's gospel. You have this legend that if you went into the pool and you were the first one in, you experienced some sort of healing because an angel would come down and touch the pool, the water, stir it up, and then voila, whoever walked in the pool would find healing first. You have this story that's there. Well, in the verse in chapter 5 of John, there's this explanation as to why people were rushing into the pool to find some sort of healing.
Right.
But that is not in the earliest manuscripts. You find it, and we actually have some manuscripts that have it in the margin. So it may have been in the margin originally as a way of explanation. Somebody knew the theory behind why people would rush into the water to find healing. And so some scribe, knowing the history of why, would put some sort of writing there to indicate to a reader who's reading it, like, why is everybody wanting to run into this water? Well, because they thought an angel came down and touched it. Now we know it wasn't an angel. They excavated that whole section and it was some sort of boiling spring under the ground. But at the end of the day, the Jews apparently had a legend that some angel would do this and stir the water. And so a scribe ended up putting the explanation there. And as a result of the commentary and the explanation, it found itself into the textual tradition in some streams. So it's not unusual to even see that in the New Testament, where scribes have a tendency to expand more than they would to subtract. And sometimes it's in an explanation kind of form, like the variant you showed about Hezekiah. Like, to me, as a Gentile living in our day, it's nice to know that. It's like, oh, well, that's good information. I appreciate that. But when you're doing textual criticism, the point of it is, what did Isaiah actually write? That's what we're trying to, what would have been more likely for Isaiah to have written, the writer of Isaiah to have written, not so much what somebody commentated. I like commentaries. They're helpful, but I want the original to be what's original and what's commentary to be commentary, and them separated. But we do see the same thing in the New Testament text as well.
Similar things. Yes. So, getting back to this, this is, pull it back up again, and I will go back to, there we go. So this is Isaiah, chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. I've highlighted the text here of basically the end of 2 verse 9 and what follows. In 1Q, so in the Masoretic text and in the Septuagint, the text of 2:9 all the way through to 11 reads, "So humankind is humbled and everyone is brought low. Do not forgive them. Enter into the rock and hide in the dust, for the terror of Yahweh is from the glory of his majesty." And then there's another expansion within the Septuagint where it says, "When he rises to terrify the earth." And then it continues in verse 11, "The haughty eyes of humankind will be brought low, and human pride will be humbled. Yahweh alone will be exalted on that day." So what's happening in 1Q Isaiah A, though, is we see verse 9 there. So humankind is humbled and everyone is brought low. But then the text just moves on, misses the rest of verse 9, this "do not forgive them," all of verse 10, and then just continues with verse 11. "The haughty eyes of humankind will be brought low, and human pride will be humbled." So here we have a case where, yes, it certainly appears that 1Q Isaiah A preserves, and I'll just finish this and then I'll explain a little bit about doing textual criticism. Here we have an example of where the text of 1Q Isaiah A seems to preserve something older that has been expanded in both the Masoretic text and the Septuagint. Now, one of the ways that scholars will evaluate texts the ways textual critics will evaluate texts is they'll ask questions about the nature of the difference. Many times, what you see when a text is shorter, when there's something missing, is that a scribe who is copying, his eye will skip to another part of the manuscript he's copying, and he'll miss a chunk of text because of that. And that's called shoot, what is that called now? Is that homeotelioton, I think, or haplography? I think that's haplographic. These technical terms, I always get them mixed up. So then there's other instances. Yes, that's haplographic. That's haplography. So and that's where a scribe is copying, and then he loses his place. Maybe he's getting some more ink on his stylus, and when he goes back, he ends up in a different place on the manuscript because the word is the same or similar as to where he left off, right? So, and that's how text can be lost. Something else that scribes will do is they will copy something out. They'll, they will lose their place, and then they'll end up copying out the same thing again. That's called homeotelioton. So, but this is an instance where it doesn't look like this has happened. This is one of these places within the text where there doesn't appear to have been any sort of accidental omission. It certainly looks to be the case that the scribe is just copying off a text that flows directly from the middle of verse 9 to the beginning of verse 11, completely missing the end of verse 9 and all of verse 10. So, one of the no, go ahead.
No, that's interesting, because the Old Testament textual criticism is slightly different, but there are some similarities to the New Testament textual criticism, because New Testament typically has way more to work with.
Yes, and
here you have a few Hebrew. You're comparing it to the Septuagint with the Greek, so a lot less to compare to than what New Testament does. So this is an interesting situation where the Isaiah scroll, 1Q Isaiah A, seems to be, what you're insinuating is preserving something pretty old, but it's an expansion old. Am I understanding
that right? In
this
case, this is pretty old, and it shows that both the Masoretic text and the Septuagint are expansions of.
They're the expansions, and they're maintaining what would have been something.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is similar to like what I showed earlier, where the Septuagint preserves the older part, but it's the Masoretic text that is expanded. So
sure, because we don't know what the Septuagint is translating. Yeah, because the Septuagint is quite old, and we don't know what they're translating. So they obviously had an older manuscript, so that's always something to keep in mind too.
And I have to say something else about 1Q Isaiah A here that I think is important. Sure. When it comes to the manuscripts of that preserve Bible texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls, scholars have tried hard to classify them as either more closely aligning to the Masoretic text or to the Septuagint, for example, or to the Samaritan Pentateuch where applicable. For example, 1Q Isaiah B is what's called a proto-Masoretic text because it looks very much like the Masoretic version of Isaiah. 1Q Isaiah A is a problem, though, because it doesn't look like it more closely aligns to one or the other. It's pretty mixed. And there's so many really dynamic, unusual types of variants within 1Q Isaiah A that scholars generally tend to regard it as unclassified or as non-aligned is the word. There's actually a huge number of non-aligned texts within the Dead Sea Scrolls which don't look enough like the Masoretic text or the Septuagint or the Samaritan Pentateuch to be classified one way or the other. They're you know, uh, the one of the the great text critical scholars, Dead Sea Scroll scholars, Eugene Ulrich, who actually edited 1Q Isaiah A, has talked about manuscripts as like individual snapshots of this very large, extensive scribal process. And as such, he doesn't particularly even like classifying texts as Masoretic or Septuagint or as non-aligned, because for him, he's like, they're all kind of their own thing. They are all their own literary edition in this large stream of textual transmission, which is why you have so many texts that don't seem to go one way or the other. They preserve all sorts of textual variation between the surviving versions. So the picture of transmission, certainly in the 2nd century BCE, the 1st century BCE, and for those manuscripts that we have from the 1st century CE in the Dead Sea Scrolls, seem to reflect this picture of a really dynamic text that is not it's not being parted out into these more readily recognized versions so clearly. So but I think one of the remarkable things about 1Q Isaiah A, and where most of the work has been set on, and I think one of where most of the interesting discussion of the most interesting textual discussions take place in the second half. So 1Q Isaiah A, and I have a few slides later on which show this in some greater detail. 1Q Isaiah A is a manuscript. It's a complete copy of the book of Isaiah, but it's pretty clearly divided right down the middle. Chapters 1 to 33 are on, I think it's 7 or 8 sheets, and then it has a break, and there's blank lines at the bottom at the end of chapter 34, indicating the pretty much the end of this section. And then chapter 34 begins anew on a new column on a new sheet. So right away, scholars looked at this and said, "Oh wow, that's pretty interesting that we've got this bisection right in the middle of Isaiah." And then the other thing that we noticed is that in this second half of 1Q Isaiah A, between chapters 34 and 66, all of a sudden there is a huge number of the more dramatic textual differences. You've got several sections within the text where the scribe has left blank space. I show a picture of this here. This is, I have to pull this up here. I think this is chapter 34. Yeah, so this is chapter 34. Verses 17 through 35, verse 2. And you'll see what's happened here is the scribe has written out chapter 34 almost to the end of verse 17, but not quite. He ends with this phrase, ad olam, and then he's left like one blank line, and then dropped down, and he's continued writing from chapter 35, verse 3. So he's missed a huge chunk of text here. Originally, when he looked at this, Eugene Ulrich looked at this and said, "You know what?" And there are 7 of these places within the Great Isaiah Scroll where the scribe has left this huge chunk of space empty. and continued on to a later section of the text. And then another scribe has come along and filled in what's missing. Eugene Ulrich originally suggested, well, this is further evidence of an older text type of Isaiah here in 1Q Isaiah A, and somebody else has come along and then added the stuff that was updating it. So here's how the text reads in 1Q Isaiah A. He cast, this is starting in chapter 34, verse 17. He cast the lot for them. His hand has portioned it out to them with the line forever. And then there's the blank space, and he continues, strengthen the weak hands and make firm feeble knees. So here's what's missing. First of all, there's the addition of this word, Yeroshua, in the margin, which means they shall possess it. And then this second scribe has added all this below in this marginal space, all this missing text. So now the text reads, he shall cast the lot for them. His hand has apportioned it out to them with the line. And that's where the sentence ends now. Forever they shall possess it. From generation to generation they shall live in it. The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom. Like a crocus it shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, and the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of Yahweh, the majesty of our God. So this is all that's been added here in this smaller script in this blank space.
Is there any theory as to how long of a gap was that between scribe and scribe, where the corrector, if you want to call
it's pretty close. It's pretty close. It's in terms of time, you mean?
Yes,
it's pretty close. And there was actually quite a bit of debate as to whether or not this was even the same scribe. Some, I think, early on, it was suggested that that this was actually the same scribe, just making the addition. But it's since been recognized that no, this is a second hand at work. But it is happening pretty close in time. So, but
would the first hand have just lacked it in a manuscript?
So here's what's actually going on, and it's pretty ingenious, I think.
Okay.
So what's happening, there's, as I said, there's 7 of these instances throughout this second half of Isaiah, and it's only in the second half of Isaiah. So why? Like, what is going on here? So there's a guy by the name, a scholar who was last working on the Hands That Wrote the Bible project at the University of Groningen. His name is Drew Longaker. He wrote a very, very good article all about this back in, I think it was 2011, 2012, where he showed pretty convincingly that what's happening in the second half of Isaiah is that this part of 1Q Isaiah A was actually copied from an entirely different manuscript as the first half of 1Q Isaiah A. And what's happening is that you can mark all these places where the scribe has left blanks, plus a few other places that I'll talk about a little bit too. And this is stuff some of this I didn't get into in the video I made about the Isaiah scrolls. So it looks like what's happening is the bottom of his manuscript of this second half of Isaiah is damaged. So he's missing bits. So he comes to a place like this and and it's missing. And so he's like, I don't know what's there, but I know something's there. I'll just leave some space. And then I'll continue at the top of the next column and I'll just keep copying. So this is what he's doing. It is a good move. It's pretty bright, but there's other places within this manuscript. And if we can just take the screen share off right now. I have to go into this this article that Drew wrote. So there's other places within 1Q Isaiah A, where in the second part where we see the scribe has clearly reached the damaged portion of the manuscript at the bottom of the column, hasn't left the blank space, but has then actually tried to just fill in the missing text from memory. And as a result, you end up with a pretty dynamic paraphrased version of like the text. And it makes total sense that like these places where the scribe is just sort of riffing and try to remember what the text says and is just filling it in from memory, they take place predominantly within like this narrative section from chapter 36 to 39, where he remembers how the story goes, right? So it seems like it's easier for him to go, oh yeah, and then this happened. I'm pretty sure this is how it sounds the last time I read it. So one of these takes place in chapter 36, verses 11 to 12. So in the Masoretic text, and in the Septuagint for that matter too. Just gonna pull this up here. There it is. So, go here. So this is the story of the Assyrian emissaries who've come to speak to King Hezekiah. And in the Masoretic text, it says, Eliakim, Shebna, and Joah replied to Rabshakeh, please speak to your servants in Aramaic. Since we understand it, do not speak to us in the Judean in the hearing of the people on the wall. But the Rabshakeh replied, was it to your master and to you that my master sent me to speak those words? It was precisely to the men who are sitting on the wall, who will have to eat their dung and drink their urine with you. So this is one of these places where we can, and what Drew has done here in his article is he's actually taken the calculations of distance from these places where there appear to be these breaks, and then also these places where the scribe has tried to freely fill in the missing text, and he's mapped them all out so we know that yes, these all happen at the bottom of each subsequent column, right? So here the scribe at 1Q Isaiah A seems to be very obviously trying to reconstruct this from memory, because the way he reconstructs this bit, he says, they said to him, so using the plural verb form of the verb instead of the singular, Eliakim and Shavna and Yonah, speak now with your servants in Aramaic, for we understand it, and do not speak to us these words in the hearing of the men who are sitting on the wall. Now, what's really interesting here he's missed this. He's missed this part of the text where it says, "Do not speak to us in the Judean language." Right? That was missed. So, and we know, and he missed it because he's just doing this by memory, trying to remember what the text says, but also drawing from what appears later in the text. He uses this same phrase, those who are sitting on the wall. He uses that exact same phrase in the earlier section to refer to the men who are on the wall, where it's not supposed to be. So it's one of these. I think it's a pretty neat instance where the scribe has, we can see kind of what's going on within this manuscript, and the scribe is in the first place, he's making sure that he's covering his own tracks for those places where he doesn't know what the text should read because it's not there. So I'm going to leave the space for it, and maybe I'll come back or somebody else would come back and fill it in. But then in places where he's missing text, but he thinks he's got a pretty good idea of what's there, he's just filling it in off of memory and like doing a pretty good job, but obviously it's not the same, right?
That happens when I was doing a lot of my dissertation work from the church fathers. You can tell the difference at times when they're actually copying a text and when they're going from memory, because it's pretty close. And then it's like, whoa, they got way out of hand. They're almost giving a commentary. It's almost like they're going off of their memory. But would that indicate that the scribe was probably, if he's that familiar to know that section, that this is not his first day on the job. Like, this is something that he's probably done pretty regularly. And I mean, come on, that's a lot of words, whatever it is, 25,000 words or whatever is in Isaiah. Right. And you at least remember the idea of the text. If not the words, you remember the idea of it. Would that probably indicate that the scribe was doing this multiple times? This wasn't his first day on the job. He was familiar with at least enough of it to put there.
Something that we also need to make clear here are like, I don't think what's happening here is indicative, you're right, of the fact that this particular scribe knows the book of Isaiah really well. We can say that much. We can't say that for, all scribes or even all types of scribes. In the work that I do, one of the things that we try to do is, when I evaluate the script of a manuscript, I'm also trying to evaluate its function, as well as who or what type of person was copying it. Because one of the things that we're relatively confident of is that there was a professional guild of scribes where this was their job. You would, come in and say, can you please, produce for me a copy of this book? And, you pay them money and they make what you want, a copy of the book of Genesis or a copy of the book of Isaiah or what have you. Professional scribes were very good at writing clearly and legibly. It's not even a guarantee that all professional scribes knew how to read particularly well. It wasn't necessary. If all you have to do is copy the letters, then, just make sure that it looks the same and you're good. What we tend to see is we see a number of those types of manuscripts in, the Qumran caves, but not nearly as much as we see in like the Bar Kokhba caves or at Masada or at Murabbat, where some of these later finds closer to the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century were found. These are almost all of the like literature in these caves were written by obviously professional scribes, people who were commissioned to do it. At the Dead Sea within the Dead Sea Scrolls, we get a lot of manuscripts where the writing is not as crisp and clean and formal. It's still clear and legible, but it's written by somebody who does a lot of writing. But the type of writing that would be like literary writing or compositional writing, this indicates to me that this is somebody who definitely reads and writes. They don't just write for a living, as in copying text. They're readers. Maybe they're scholars. So I think when it comes to something like 1Q Isaiah A, that's what we have going on here is a scribe who is pretty learned, which isn't necessarily the norm. But it's, it's indicative of whoever it was that was handling this particular manuscript.
So how many scribes total, since you'd mentioned that there was some debate about whether or not the same scribe went back, filled it in, or secondary?
Yeah.
I mean, that's uncommon. Again, in the New Testament, we have second and third hands that come into it, and you have to document it because maybe the second hand had a better reading than the first hand or something like that. How many estimated scribes are debated as possibilities of being a part of the main. Yes, this one right here, the QA.
So at least two.
At least two.
Now the Hands That Wrote the Bible project at the University of Groningen has they published an article, I think it was 2 years ago now, where they, using artificial intelligence and machine learning, they have argued, I think pretty persuasively, that it's 3 scribes in total. So not only do you have the situation for 1Q Isaiah A is pretty simply this: you have a single manuscript copy of the book of Isaiah, but it is comprised of 2 individual scrolls of Isaiah, the first being Isaiah chapter 1 through 33, copied by 1 scribe, and then you have a second part copied by a second scribe, who is a different scribe, but one who is doing his best also to emulate the style of the first scribe. So, and working from a separate copy, as I mentioned, he's got a copy of, this second half of Isaiah that he's using that is different from the scribe who penned the first half, and his is damaged. And then you have a third scribe who's come along and filled in the missing parts that appeared at, in the damaged portions of the second scribe's source. So
that would make sense to me. That would make sense to me too, because what you said earlier, Kipp, was talking about how most manuscripts are not going to be like 1QA. They're not going to be that massive. Yeah. So even if they're copying onto this large scroll, they're probably not copying it from maybe they are, but more than likely not the same size of a scroll. So they may have had pieces of Isaiah to put together one giant scroll. So would this scroll be dedicated to public reading? Maybe was there a reason they were all trying to keep it on one?
So I think what's happened, what we see in 1Q Isaiah A, I'm suggesting is reflective of the history of the development of the book of Isaiah as a whole. And this is not just, this is also reflected in the other copies of Isaiah that we have at Qumran. So, as I said, there were 11 caves. There were 22 copies in total of the book of Isaiah, discovered dispersed between cave 1, cave 4, cave 6, maybe some of the others. I don't think there was any in cave 11, interestingly. But dispersed between a few of these caves, we have a total of 22 copies. By far, most of them were in cave 4. I think it was something like 15 or 16 copies of Isaiah from cave 4. But what we find that is really, really interesting of the cave 4 copies is, of those 16, there's only 2 that look like they were complete copies of all of Isaiah. All the others are either only the first half of Isaiah or the second half of Isaiah. So this suggests pretty strongly, I think, that at this time in the 1st century BCE, which is sort of where you can group most of the manuscripts from the Dead Sea Scrolls around the 1st century BCE. That's where most of them are. In the 1st century BCE, it looks like the book of Isaiah was circulating still as like 2 separate compositions, 2 separate scrolls. Somebody decided to put them together for this particular manuscript, 1Q Isaiah A. 1Q Isaiah B, which was copied a little bit later, was copied from an intact copy of Isaiah where they were put together. So we're looking at a period where this transition is taking place, where more and more these 2 halves of the book of Isaiah are starting to be put together, with some regularity. And this reflects ideas about the developmental composition of Isaiah stretching back into antiquity. Scholars have argued for years now that the 8th century prophet Isaiah, only wrote stuff that was in the first half. They would say all the way up to, prophecies of Isaiah up to about chapter 33, 34, 35. And then there's this narrative section from chapter 36 to 39, which scholars have suggested served as like a conclusion to this first book of Isaiah that was produced in and around the 8th, 7th century or whatever, right? But then during the Babylonian exile, there were a whole bunch of prophecies which were then written, which bear a lot of the telltale features of terminology from the book of Isaiah, some similarities in their theological conceptions from this earlier book of Isaiah, seem to have been inspired by much of what's in the book of Isaiah, but they're anonymous, and they were written later in time. And then, even later, after the Second Temple was rebuilt, there's additional prophecies. So what scholars will say is it looks like the book of Isaiah is something that was growing and expanding over hundreds of years. And they'll make these arguments on the basis of what the text, what the individual prophecies themselves appear to be about, where they appear to be historically situated, what the kinds of issues they're addressing, what is happening with the temple in these texts is a big big important question. So I would say, like, when I look at 1Q Isaiah, when I look at Isaiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is what I see. I see, a reflection of a time when, these two parts, at least, of Isaiah were not always together.
Yeah, and I know you and I, have talked.
This is
on
where
the phone.
we would differ.
Yeah, well, we actually agree on the fact that there are section differences. That there seems to be 3 sections off of Isaiah. One of the things that it seemed like to me that Isaiah was not looking to compile an entire narrative and put it together the way that we see Isaiah constructed. I mean, to me, that would not have been his original intent. The beginning of Isaiah talks about all the different kings that he was of service to, and even going into 2 Kings and so forth, it talks about how Isaiah wrote an entire pretty much biography of Uzziah, but we don't have that. So Isaiah seemed to like writing narrative, or he liked writing concepts and things. And then I've even mentioned in multiple times on my program, when you read Isaiah, you have to see there is a transition between seems to be a commentary of Isaiah's life versus him talking about his own life. Like, you go to chapter 6, I saw the Lord seated on the throne, high lifted up. Then you go just a chapter later, these things were said when Isaiah did these things. And then it's like there's somebody commentary of his life. And so you and I have talked about this too, and those that have watched this program or have listened to some of my discussion, I actually believe that there were disciples, or if you would, those that followed the school teachings of Isaiah, who did compile a lot of Isaiah's writings later and actually put them together the way that they are ultimately to what we see them today. See, that bothers some people. That does bother. It doesn't bother me. I can live with that. I live with it. Most Christians live with it with the Psalms. They're split into 5 books, and they're not in order, and they're not one single writer. So, like, I don't have a problem with this collection being the way that it is, and I think it's actually
there are several Psalms. I think you would agree that with this, at least, there are certainly several Psalms that were written during the exile.
Sure. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
right?
Many
So
years
it's
later.
yes, that all got thrown into this larger collection.
Yeah,
So yeah,
Asaph, the
it's
sons of Korah, Ethan. I mean, these are different
yeah.
time periods. I mean, you have Psalm 90 was attested to Moses, and then you also have the sons of Korah, which would have been not far after that. You have a couple hundred years easily
Well,
between
and
some of the writers.
attribution within the Psalms is really problematic as well, as I'm sure you know, because we have attributions seemingly this is something, it's been a while since I looked at this, but I know that it's different again when you look at the Masoretic text compared to the Septuagint.
Yeah.
Um and here, it's when within the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have this pretty remarkable collection of psalms from Cave 11,
Hmm.
11Q5, the the 11Q Psalm Scroll A, which purports to be a collection of the Psalms of David. Um, and has them in a pretty uh interesting and different arrangement compared to anything else that we have. It has psalms that, the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, neither of which attribute to David within this
Hmm.
collection of Psalms of David. And then you've got things that we've never even seen before, like something like this so-called apostrophe of Zion is a psalm attributed to David within this manuscript that is has been lost, you know, until this scroll was discovered
Discovery.
and we saw it again, right? Psalm 153 and 154, which are in the I believe it's the Syriac Psalter, are both in this manuscript. So it's so that to say that
And
the
we thought they were crazy.
attribution,
We thought we made that up. We thought they made that up years ago, and turns out they weren't so crazy after all. And obviously, the
well,
Septuagint has
yeah,
151,
yeah,
so there was one
yeah.
additional in the Septuagint, and then the Syriac.
So
We're like they're crazy. They made up an extra few, and then it's like, well, maybe
no,
not. There's
I think what's a much more realistic perspective of what's actually going on is that in early Judaism there were all sorts of different collections of psalms, and they didn't all look the same, and some of them
no.
had things in them that others didn't. But it's because they were collections and because individual psalms circulated individually as well as
Oh,
within these
100%.
collections. And we have I mean the psalms in the Dead Sea Scrolls are pretty wild. Like you've got tons and tons of manuscripts with psalms in them, but most of them aren't like the whole book, right? Most of them are just that. They're like three psalms together on a single manuscript, or eight. But yeah, it's this is the nature of how this literature was. Um, Collections themselves were constructed out of individual pieces, and quite often around the personality of a figure like David, or a figure like Isaiah or Jeremiah, or you know, well,
Yeah,
who
and
have
so
you?
to me, so to those that are listening that love the book of Isaiah, you study book of Isaiah, like it's okay if this is a a long time coming to bring together a one unit. Like compilers don't have to be the original writer. Like, and I know that that bothers some people maybe watching the program, but we just gave an example of the psalmist, and I don't know of anybody that thinks that David compiled the whole psalm. But because I don't know of anybody in Christian. I hope not. I hope you're not watching this program if you
I
do.
personally think he
Uh,
didn't write any, but that's just me. So
well, Kip, you're wrong about a lot of
yeah, I know.
things,
I
and
know I
that
am.
right now. So,
Most things.
but
Yeah.
to me, and I've used this example on the phone with you. Like I love the fan. They're all sitting right over here in my glass case. They're better taken care of than my dog. Now my wife takes care of my dog, But those books are probably more important to me than my dog, even though my dog's name is Gandalf, who is named after what's in these books, because I'm a Tolkien fan, of course.
Yeah.
He had no choice. He's not even gray. He's black with white spots, but I called him Gandalf anyway. But when you look at these collections, three of my favorite works from Tolkien, most people look at you like, what are you talking about? Is the Children of Húrin, the one of the greatest works I think that he ever produced was The Fall of Gondolin. One of my absolute favorite writings. And most people don't realize that Tolkien wrote these works before he wrote The Hobbit, before he wrote the Lord of the Rings trilogy. These works were written in the 20s after he was wounded in the war, and nobody knew of them until his son Christopher Tolkien published them in the text that they are in after his father had died. And like, to me, they're some of the greatest works of Tolkien that he just never published and his publisher never wanted. And yet we have a collection of them, and there's editorial notes of his son in it and other people that have studied or knew Tolkien's work. When I liken the book of Isaiah, and I know we differ here, and that's fine. I'm just talking it out on the other end of this for the audience too. I see Isaiah being very similar to perhaps how that happened. You have these followers of Isaiah, and they had a massive amount of collection probably of Isaiah. And they would have been doing this publishing or this collecting or this editing for him long after, perhaps, we don't know, but long after he was even dead. It doesn't make it less Isaiah for somebody like me. I know that you and I would differ on this point, but it doesn't make it less Isaiah for me if his disciples begin to publish some of his works that were not, because Isaiah wasn't seeking to put together this compilation. That wasn't his goal. His goal was to go speak to the kings. His goal was to talk with them and advise them and give wisdom and counsel. His goal wasn't necessarily to write everything down that was happening in his life and in their lives, although he seemed to be interested in the biography of Uzziah. But other than that, that's my perspective of Isaiah. And I know that, again, we have difference of opinion here, and that's fine. But it's okay. At the end of the day, it's okay if compilations happened after the fact. It doesn't hurt anybody.
True enough. So on that note, if I could just, I'll show you a couple things here.
Sure, I'll pull up.
Yeah. So I'm gonna stop this and I'm gonna start it again because not the because I'm gonna just share a window here. Yes, let's share that.
And again, if you have any questions, we're going to wrap our end up here in a second. If you want some questions for Dr. Kipp, please, I already see a few of them I'll pull up, but if you have any more, make sure to stick them in.
So can you see the Great Isaiah Scroll here?
Yep.
Okay. So by the way, this is the Shrine of the Book's own website. This is something that anybody can go and look at, and I love doing this. It's really cool the way they did it. When you drag your cursor, it like rolls the manuscript.
That is awesome.
Forward. Isn't that sweet? So
that is amazing.
I'm gonna draw your attention. I'm gonna go here. I'll just do it the fast way, all the way here to column 27. So,
and some of you that have never seen an Old Testament scroll, notice there's no chapter and verse content.
Yes, there you go. So here's what I've been talking about a little bit already. Oh, I'm gonna zoom back out. So this is column 27. This is chapter 33. When you get to the end of the chapter 33, verse 24, you will notice that the scribe has left 3 empty lines, and then has started chapter 34 at the top. And now remember as well, this is a different scribe now, and it is at this point that he is working from a different copy of the book of Isaiah. So what we see here, this break is pretty significant, because within, and this is universal, like we have yet to find an exception to this rule, where you see a break of this magnitude in a manuscript from the Second Temple period, it always means the same thing, and that is a compositional shift from one book to another. Some of the best examples, we see examples of this there are a handful of manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls which contain both like 2 books of the Torah, and we have preserved a handful of those where the shift from one book to the other takes place, and it looks exactly like this. The other place we see it are in collections of the minor prophets. So this, I probably have to turn this one off. Let's do this. I'm going to share a different window now. Okay. So this one here, yeah, that one. So this is a fragment from a copy of the Minor Prophet Scroll that was found in Mutabat, which is just south of Qumran. And I'll draw your attention to down here. You see basically the same thing. You've got the end of, I believe it's what is it now? I think this is Jonah, the end of the book of Jonah, right here. And then you have 1, 2, 3 empty lines, and the beginning of the prophecy of the prophet Nahum. This is Maseh Adonai. That's supposed to be Asher. And then I don't remember what that word is.
So it would have had Jonah and Nineveh connected. Jonah to Nineveh and Nahum to Nineveh connected, or
not Nahum, Micah here. No, I'm not Micah. Sure. And that's something else too. That I don't remember what I think it's Jonah. I'm not convinced that I'm right about that. I would have to go back and check. But something else that people should know is that when it comes to the minor prophets, they also appear in different orders within the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's not always consistent. The 12, yes. So, and the reason they were collected together, I think, in large part, is because they were short. And somebody decided to put them, in these collections together. And as far as we know, as far back as we can tell, which isn't that far, it's like the 2nd century BC, or maybe the 3rd, at least as far back as that, they appear to have always been collected together. So it just this is kind of how I view the book of Isaiah, and reflected in the materials at Qumran, that this was a collection of prophets who weren't all Isaiah, but the first one was, and the name Isaiah ended up getting attached to the whole thing as a result of. And I think too, I do think that even though they weren't the same person, and even though they were writing over a much longer period of time, I do think that these people were all writing in the spirit of Isaiah. They were very, very intimately familiar with this book, and were their own writings reflect that. So
I think that means we agree 1/3. We're
maybe
1/3.
1/3. Okay,
close to 1/3. That's not bad. Sure. That's not bad. We could do worse. 0. I mean, that
certainly
that be...
0 is worse. 0 is definitely worse. So cool.
So let's take.
All right. So you got some questions.
Let's see here. Well, I need to clarify something apparently, because Pat said I told you to stay in Seattle. He didn't catch the sarcasm. So I was saying that as a way of, like, if Israeli leaders were coming after me, I want them to be on the other side of the country from me. So that's why I was saying it. So it's not
now because Pat lives in Seattle. What's unfortunately going to happen is that Mossad coming to look for Stephen now in Seattle are going to find Pat.
That's fine with me. I'm totally fine with that.
I think Pat's pretty good at looking after himself too, so he's probably okay.
I hope so. So Deuteronomy 32:8. Then he sends a. So this is an interesting one to
It's
me.
like
Now, this is a
oh
big
yeah,
one to me because I think that this has the Bain Elohim there in in the Dead Sea Scrolls, whereas I think it has angelos in the Septuagint, so it has angels there,
Angelon Theu.
which
Yep.
yeah, I believe so.
Reflects
Yes.
Bene Elohim.
Yes, very similar to the whole Genesis 6, Job 1, Job 38, similar terminology in the Septuagint there.
Yep.
And then you have the Samaritan Pentateuch, who I believe covers this section as well.
Yes.
If I'm not mistaken. And the Masoretic text is alone.
No. Sorry, the Samaritan Pentateuch is with the Masoretic text.
It's with Masoretic. Okay, yes, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this kind of would you call it a little bit of national bias, perhaps? Or do you think there's actually a manuscript stream that the Masoretic text and the Samaritan Pentateuch are linked to? Because clearly the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls seem to be on similar pages. And I know that you have Latin and Syriac that are connected to this, but most of those are connected to the Septuagint as well.
Yeah.
But to me, the original reading here is not even sensible to sons of Israel, because of the very next verse. He deals with Israel almost on a separate plane from distributing these nations over to these powers, if you would. But that's just my perspective on the concepts there. But from a manuscript position, this is an interesting one, and I'm curious your opinion about it.
So, I've talked about this a few times, and I will talk about it again in my next in the next installment of my series, the Dead Sea Scrolls Unapologetically. So make sure you watch. So basically, the way this breaks down is that, like, there's a couple things at work here. Scholars are pretty much in agreement now that the Bnei Israel is a scribal change that was made, and that the text originally read Bnei Israel, where Elyon divided the nations to the sons of the gods. So now there's another part of this discussion, though, because as you noted, yes, Samaritan Pentateuch, yes, Masoretic texts both read Bnei Yisrael, which is the change. The Greek translation is Angelon Theu, which reflects the original text. I would say it's. I don't think it's the change is a nationalistic one. What's happening is that this is a harmonization. So one of the things that we know about the Samaritan Pentateuch in particular, one of the features of this particular manuscript is that it is constantly harmonizing texts of the Torah. It'll, in one section of, the book of Deuteronomy, where it's narrating something that also happened in the book of Numbers, the Samaritan Pentateuch will make sure that those two sections are pretty seamless. So there's this constant concern about ensuring that there is. Oh, hold on, sorry, my dog just.
Yeah, while you're taking care of that's an interesting perspective about the harmonization. That is an interesting point. Keep going on that.
And so, yeah, sorry, he just got his head caught in the blind string. So,
poor guy.
Hey, Dagger, come here. Oh, good. I need you. Come here. Come sit. That's a good boy. There you go. You stay there. Okay. So, harmonization. Yes. So I would say that is actually, it's not a nationalistic thing. What's happening is within this particular passage occurs within the Song of Moses, which scholars agree is kind of like the oldest part of the book of Deuteronomy. Some have suggested this was all there was, and the book of Deuteronomy was sort of built around it. I don't think so. I sort of think in the other direction. I think that while the Song of Moses is very old, it was a later appendage to the book of Deuteronomy as a whole. And it's all within this, idea of the development of the book of Deuteronomy and the development of the Torah as a whole, that you get this kind of a harmonization, this kind of a change. The reason why this passage survives in the Dead Sea Scrolls is because the particular manuscript in which it occurs is an excerpted text. So this is not the manuscript is not a complete copy of the book of Deuteronomy. It's got the 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 20, as well as Deuteronomy chapter 5, Deuteronomy chapter 6, 7, and 8, and then the Song of Moses, and that's it. That's in this quote unquote excerpted manuscript. And we have a couple of others of these as well. There's another manuscript which contains just the Song of Moses from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And interestingly, in I think it's verse 43, I always get these wrong. It's let me just look this up quickly. In I gotta go down here. So in further down. Further. So in verse 37 to 41, this particular excerpted text of Deuteronomy containing just the Song of Moses reflects the text of the Septuagint, which is quite a bit longer, more expanded than the Masoretic text again, and it contains these, what look like polytheistic elements, which have been cleaned up in the Masoretic text. So the reason these survive is precisely because they're not contained within a copy of the book of Deuteronomy. When, when people started to put the Song of Moses together with the book of Deuteronomy, they're needing to align, and they're needing to harmonize statements about, the division of the nations in Deuteronomy 32 with statements that are parallel statements that appear now in Deuteronomy chapter 4, or even if you're expanding to include the whole Torah in Genesis chapter, I think it's 49, talks about, the 70 sons of is it the 70 nations who inherited. So it's a harmonizing program which has produced some of these later readings. But because these particular manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls aren't complete copies of the book of Deuteronomy, the harmonization is unnecessary. So they preserve these older readings as a result.
Yeah, this is it's an interesting. Yeah, it does. Harmonization. Harmonization happened a lot in the New Testament manuscripts with Gospels. I can imagine in the Torah, especially Deuteronomy, being a lot of repetition of what was already stated earlier in Torah. So I can see why scribes would do a similar thing there. To me, I've never followed the Masoretic text there to be correct. It's the next verse, but the Lord's portion in his people, Jacob, he allotted his heritage. It doesn't seem like the inheritance would have been in verse 38 because it was distinguished from the other nations, verse number 8, and then brought down into verse number 9, goes straight into Israel. So even in the text, it didn't make sense, much less from a manuscript standpoint. But the text not making sense is never really the way to do the work there. You start with the fact that, do we have a variant here? Well, yeah, we do. Seems like to me that even though the terminology being the angel of gods or sons of God are similar function between Septuagint and what you just mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls, seems to me, and those are older. I mean, we're talking older, the Masoretic text there being much later than these, the ancient translation and also the Dead Sea Scrolls. So
something else I think is important to that's important to clarify here too is like from my perspective, and we talked a little bit about this on the phone too, and I'm sure you'll disagree with me about this, but from my perspective, when you're talking about ancient versions, Septuagint, Masoretic text, Samaritan Pentateuch, even the stuff within the Dead Sea Scrolls, we're pretty much only able to go as far back as about the 3rd century. Sorry, yeah, the 3rd century BCE, the 300s. And that's from an archaeological perspective as well. That is, the beginnings of the Samaritan community as we know it in Israel. We can trace about that far back. That's as far back as we can trace the translation of the Torah in the Septuagint. And because we've got this, I think I've told you in the past that really, as we get farther back from a textual perspective, certainly from a manuscript perspective of the Hebrew Bible, once you hit the Persian period pretty much, and certainly the Babylonian exile, you're talking about a black box, of which really all we can do is guess, just because we don't have the hard data to go in any direction here. So what we've got from the First Temple period in terms of scripture, what we've got from the First Temple period are like these tiny little silver amulets that were discovered at Kitif, which contain a version, or I think it's the same text on each of them, but they contain a version of like the Aaronic blessing from Numbers.
Yeah,
and
number 6.
And these are like magical amulets. Like somebody scrawled the text on them and rolled them up and wore them as like a pendant. So it's like I mean, it's not something somebody was reading either, right? It was and
more of a good luck charm or something.
Yeah, something like that. But
the church had amulets too. You had the Lord's Prayer on it.
Yeah.
I mean,
these little I think these are quite a bit later, but there's I know I've been fascinated by these little tiny miniature codices. Have you heard about these?
Miniature codices.
They're like medieval. I attended a session and at SBL once about these little miniature codices that had tiny little, but full gospels, like a full Gospel of John in this tiny little codex that somebody would like wear around their neck, or they would,
like good luck charm.
If someone was sick, they'd stick it on the forehead.
I saw would actually do that now in our world with bracelets, where you can get the whole entire Bible on a piece like this big. It's like, what?
Oh my God.
Like, how does somebody how do you even validate that? Like, who's gonna eye check that? The whole entire 66 books of the Bible is on this little piece on your bracelet. I'd like to see the fact check on that. But
that is a novelty.
Pat brought up here oldest, because we've talked about oldest might not be the original. Well, we understand that. I mean, that's true we have manuscripts in the New Testament that are older than some. It doesn't automatically make it a good reflection of what the initial text would have been. That's understood. It does point to a specific point in history. Now, in the New Testament, we can pretty much locationally separate influences of text. Like Western texts had a lot of Latin influence in it. Then you had down in the Egyptian, Alexandrian area, and then the Byzantine Empire and its manuscript readings. In the Qumran community, they clearly have the same Isaiah in the sense of like overall same book. It's the same collection.
Well,
there are the variants that we talked about. There are the
nuances. Importantly, their individual manuscripts seem to reflect this idea of bisection in Isaiah 2.
Yes.
Which I think is really, really important. But yeah.
And that would make more sense being on something older than on the Masoretic. Is just whatever they used. They didn't have the decency to tell us. Whatever they used, they put down in just one book. But when we're dealing with that, it does appear, though, that whatever the Septuagint translators had, if there really were 70, or 72, depending on.
So yeah, and I think too. The Septuagint. I tend to think there probably was a program in Alexandria to churn out a Greek translation of the Torah, but I also tend to think lots of these other texts, which got translated into Greek outside of the Torah, were likely like independent projects that got put together over time, right? So
sure, because there are fragments of Greek. There are
70.
Greek in the Dead Sea Scroll, very small amounts, but compared to the Hebrew.
And that's something interesting too. So I believe it's all the Greek texts in the Qumran scrolls were found in one cave, and that was cave 7. And I am not sure what to do with those. By and large, I would say the texts of the Dead Sea Scrolls are Hebrew and they're Aramaic, and there's a whole other interesting discussion about that we can't get into. But we've got a handful of these Greek manuscripts, but they were all found in one cave, and I tend to think there's a realistic possibility that this cave of tiny Greek fragments was maybe has been misassigned to the same group just by virtue of its proximity. It's close, when in actual fact there's like literally thousands of caves that dot the western shore of the Dead Sea. If this was some poor guy who was hiding out and had some poor Greek speaking Jew who was fleeing Jerusalem and decided to hide out in this cave that was close to Qumran with a handful of Greek manuscripts, and ended up meeting Romans, unfortunately. If that's what happened, how would we know any different, right? Like, I think I tend to think with the Greek materials at Qumran, at least, I'm kind of like, were they actually part of this same collection? I'm not convinced.
Or something that made itself in from other locations. And being that, and so, and that's the thing, that what could be said is that the Masoretic text, the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Dead Sea Scrolls, they do not seem to have the exact same ancestry of distribution. So they do seem to have locational influence. So what might be at the Dead Sea Scroll, you have some nuances there that come from the tradition, perhaps in that area. The Masoretic texts seem to have interpretational things in theirs, so they have their tradition. You have the Septuagint, which, again, if they're Alexandrian Jews, the types of manuscripts that they're going to have are probably going to look a little bit different than what they had at Qumran, because they're in a different part of the world. Maybe they had a different, errors in their transmission, or additions or commentation as well. So in that regard, it is good to look at all of them, given the fact that they don't have a single ancestor when it comes to, because like you said, we're talking about manuscripts that are in the first century, 2nd century BC here, or translations of that era. We don't have something closer to when Isaiah was alive. It is actually, to me, a good thing. And I've said this before about New Testament textual criticism. It is a good thing that we have variants. It is a good thing that we actually have different regional texts that we can now look at in one setting and see the history and the development, or where things may have came into the text later, what was commentary, what was probably not. Like looking at Deuteronomy 32. Because we can look at all the pieces, we can look at the Samaritan Pentateuch, we can look at the Masoretic text, we can look at the Septuagint, we can look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, even the Syriac there. We can go, okay, we're looking at a massive amount of location, different scribal groups, different years, and we can make a better decision about the text because of the plethora of manuscript help and translational help that we have. Not as much as we would have in a New Testament scenario. Certainly we would in that regard. But even in the Old Testament, it's good, I think, to have differences are not bad. I know that everybody's afraid of variance. It's like a bad word or something.
This is actually a very, I mean, it's really a very Jewish approach to the text and the religion. We've got literally dozens upon dozens upon dozens of volumes of commentary and introspection about the text and about religious practice from the medieval rabbis, precisely for this reason, that for them, you know, the variety and the discussion and the dissent even about a lot of these things was all part of their own religious journey. So
yep. And Explore Reality, which I believe that would be Than, is complimenting your jawline.
My jawline. So I've repositioned my my camera now. I think I like this better. Thanks, Dan.
Well, he must like it too. And so I was looking at these miniature scriptures, and then I had Pat would put up there. I know exactly. So I know what you're talking about now. So I've actually seen. I didn't know they went back to the medieval. I guess I didn't pay attention to the dates on them. I've actually seen in person like an 1800s. I've seen them before in the 1800s. I've actually seen one in person. I don't think it was. I think it was just the New Testament, though. I don't think it was anything. I'm sure they have them now in both, but I was at somebody's house. They actually had like an 1800s little miniature thumb Bible or whatever they call them.
Yep.
And I don't remember. I guess they went back even earlier than that, but obviously their data. I mean, this one was in English. This one was in English.
But it
was in the 1800s. So, but yes, thank you, Pat, for clarifying. There's one more.
I don't know why this made me think of this, but I wanted to say something about so when I was in I think this was Cambridge. When I was in Cambridge, once we visited one of the libraries there, and they had a bunch of really interesting New Testament manuscripts. But the one that really captured my attention was a codex of the Gospels. What do you call that when they're all in? It was like like they're all in parallel columns. What is that? It's like
talking about from language to language. Is it one language to another?
It was just the 4 Gospels in Greek, but each Gospel had its own individual column on the same page.
Oh yes.
Right. I can't remember what the
so this is which manuscript?
Kind of like the hexapla. I don't even remember the name of the manuscript. The thing that
the Job hexapla or something like that, where you're going through the different works of Origin.
But the thing that absolutely drew my attention to this is the scribe very carefully had the columns spaced out such and in different widths, precisely so that he could start and finish on the exact same line.
Is that intelligent though?
Like the work that you have to think that
through. Like we could put it in a computer now and do word counts and like we can put all that in a computer, do a word count, do some subtractions and division. But see, that's the thing. Like, but those kind of manuscripts actually demonstrate to us that harmonization did happen a lot, where a reading in Matthew made it into Luke, or Luke made it into Matthew, because a scribe's like, wait a minute, that part's missing in Luke's. story, and then they would to harmonize it. It happened in Luke 17:36. I mean, there's multiple places where this happens. It's things like that forced harmonization to happen, unfortunately. But it is extraordinary how these scribes, without the technological advancement that we have today, that we could just like how many words are Matthew, how many is in the law, and then say, okay, how do we divide this into pages and paragraphs? They're doing it in their brain, writing it out probably on.
Yeah, I think
incredible.
When I look at that, I think what he probably had to do, what he probably ended up doing, was literally counting all the letters in each gospel, right? And then basically saying, I want, I've got this much space to work with. So how many letters can I fit? And you could it's the good thing is this works okay in Greek because you don't have to add any word spaces, and you can just continue a word from one line to the next, right? So
yeah, in the uncial text, yeah.
Yeah, much harder to do in Hebrew, but it was pretty remarkable though.
We got one last question here, and
All
it's
right,
from
and then I'm gonna
John
have to run.
Beasley. Yeah, one last question. John Beasley, are the variants meaningful and viable, or are they mostly spelling differences in versions? Which he asked this before we went through a lot. So
see, I was going to say I was going to be very disappointed in John for not paying
no.
attention.
No, this is an earlier question. This is an earlier question. So it went through.
I would say so. Yeah, I would summarize by saying the variants that we have are they are, of course, they're mostly spelling differences and versions, lots and lots of mistakes, and small places where scribes have tried to fix what they perceive to be a mistake. By and large, I would say that's most of what we have, but we do have a handful of instances where it does make a big difference to what's in the text. But I think I would say that what the variants, certainly within the Qumran scrolls, speak most meaningfully about to me as a scholar is how this whole process of textual transmission occurred in the first place. So what I tend to do, I for me, my snapshot is just these manuscripts from this place, in this one small period of time of about 100 or 200 years. And what I see taking place there, uh, is basically what I don't assume that this just started and ended there. My expectation is that this is just a continuation of what's been happening since the very first time a scribe sat down to write out the text that he had, which now survives in our Bibles. So they're a big deal in that they illustrate to us just the whole process of textual transmission, of scripture transmission and interpretation.
And overall, we both would agree they did a great job. I mean, we to maintain the text of Isaiah as a whole, even with the variants, it's a pretty great work. Even with the differences, we don't have like a weird giant section of Isaiah that's extended beyond what we have. There may be a line or two or three, but there's not this whole new Isaiah where we've like, to me, that's what's unique. And I think that's what some of these apologists are trying to say, but they're not saying it thorough enough. They're not, or as you said, they're misleading, not complete. What they're saying is we don't have a different book of Isaiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We don't have a different, and now you would nuance that.
And this is where I would differ with you, in that I think that the large editions I would identify as second and third Isaiah actually do make a really big difference, and they are they produce quite a different overall text. So and again, and that's something that, but this is sort of the nature of the work, right? You know, I would agree with you that the scribes did a great job insofar as uh you know, as far as we can tell on the, you know, depending on how far back we can look. And I guess did a great job is something that um we might talk about too, because I think doing a great job of preserving a work is also keeping it current, keeping it relevant, making sure that it still speaks meaningfully to the people who are reading it. Which is, and sometimes in order to do that, scribes are making changes to the text. As you know, I
Well,
think this is, yeah. So
as it relates to second and third Isaiah, though, that you would call second and third Isaiah, it
mhm.
doesn't deviate from those same sections in what we already had in the Masoretic text, though there are
No, but
variants.
yeah, and I also, but again, I like for me, I think the problem is that I can only go back this far, and then everything past that, I
No,
just,
but my
you know,
point
we're
was,
left
is I
guessing,
think what
right?
the apologists, are saying there is that
Yeah.
the Masoretic Isaiah from chapter
Mm-hmm.
1 to 66, Dead Sea Scrolls, even though you would define the sections clearly, we're
Mm-hmm.
not getting like first, second Isaiah and the Dead Sea Scrolls are consistent, not perfectly consistent, but consistent with ours. And then the third
Yep.
section, it's like this whole new work, this whole new writing we've never seen before that is completely different from the one we had in the Masoretic text.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think that my point was, I think we agree on that aspect, that there is a consistency from 1 to
Yeah.
66 in narrative. There's a
Yeah.
consistency in what's being said. So just to be clear, I wasn't trying to belittle or push your position aside and say, well, you actually agree with us. What I meant by that is we would agree from 1 to 66, we have the same narrative, the same layout, the same consistency of thought. There's difference and variation in it. And I
Yeah.
think what the other apologist friends and colleagues are saying
Mm-hmm.
is we didn't end up with like an apocryphal work of Isaiah at the end that we've never seen before, because that is something that is different in some places, like Daniel versus Septuagint Daniel.
Yeah.
I mean, you have Bell and
Yeah,
the
that's true.
Dragon, and
Yep.
so like we didn't
And in
see
the
that
Dead
in
Sea
Isaiah
Scrolls.
and in the
So
Dead Sea
Daniel's
Scrolls.
wild when it comes
Yeah,
within
so,
the Dead Sea Scrolls.
and then
Daniel's
there's
pretty wild.
commentary to back some of this up too. But I think that's
Yeah.
what these guys are saying. But I think to go back to what we started this program with, we in the Christian circles of apologetics have to state things more carefully, uh,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
not to
I would agree.
mislead. And I don't necessarily think the guys that you played were intentionally trying to mislead anybody. I
I
think they
don't
were
think they
trying to make.
know.
I think they were.
See,
I would agree with that.
this is I think, and it's because of the way these narratives tend to get repeated in the public over and over again, right? Um, this so I just think people have no idea what the text of scripture in the Dead Sea Scrolls looks like. Um,
Which
so
is why we're doing this
when
show.
yeah, it's why I'm doing the video series that I'm doing. So to try and inform people, look, this is what's actually there. So, and yeah, I would totally agree with you in that uh they weren't it's not an intention to it's there's not an intent to mislead there. It's just a reflection of the fact that you just don't know.
Well, and I
So,
think that's why all of us who are watching this, no matter where you land, is that we are careful with the data. And if we don't
yeah,
know,
be
find
clear
out.
about it. Yeah.
And if you can't find out, then just stay silent. That's the nature of that.
Yep.
Well, Dr. Kipp, thank
Good.
you for joining the program. I'm sure
It's been
a
my
lot of people
pleasure.
learned things they have never heard before and learned even in differing, there's tremendous amount of documentation in this, and you've done a tremendous amount of work. I enjoy your videos. There'll be a link for those to follow along with it as well. So thank you, everybody, for joining us, and have a good night.